To start with the endocrine system, first we're going to talk about hormones. So these came up in AMP1 a little bit, but we're going to dive in further into this exercise. So with hormones, hormones are chemical messengers that are released into the blood. And these chemical messengers that are released into the blood are carrying some sort of communication pattern. And so they are going to be produced in one place in the body, and they are going to be released into the blood, and they will travel throughout the body looking for a specific receptor to be able to have that communication transferred. The goal of a hormone is to be able to regulate homeostasis. So if there's a piece of communication that needs to be said from one place to another in order to have a process turn on or a process turn off, hormones are used for that communication pathway. As I said, they are going to be released in the blood, so that means they can hit a bunch of different types of organs. They can travel throughout the entire body. So if we're trying to release a messenger into the blood, we don't necessarily want it to communicate to everything. It may not need to communicate to everything. So a hormone is going to target a specific organ when it's released into the blood. And that organ will have a receptor, and that receptor is going to be geared for that hormone. So that way, when that hormone is released into the blood, he only communicates with the organ that he needs to. So when we're talking about the hormones, we're also talking about the world of the endocrine system and endocrine glands in particular. So endocrine glands are going to be these glands that you have in the body that are going to release a hormone. And I'm just going to use a big H to shorthand for hormone. They are going to release the hormone directly into the blood. So sometimes these are going to be called ductless systems, because if you have a pathway and you are going to have a system where you are going to get a different color here, and you're releasing this hormone from point A to point B, and this is the pathway that he needs to travel on. If I'm going to release him into the system from here and he's going to communicate to here, he's already released into the system. He does not have any way to get outside. So there's no opening, or it's called ductless. You're also going to have glands that are called exocrine glands. And an exocrine gland is going to release a hormone, but instead of releasing it directly into the blood, this will release whatever hormone he produces outside of the system. So that kind of sounds counterintuitive, but we're going to break that down in a second. So if endocrine glands are going to be considered ductless, exocrine glands are going to have ducts. So that essentially means they are going to have an opening that will release them to the outside system. So if we're going to have a hormone produced here and he needs to go here, but there is actually going to be a barrier here, for this hormone to go through here, he is going to go through some sort of door or some sort of opening. So an exocrine gland will still release the hormone, but he's releasing it outside of the system. Some examples of an exocrine gland, which kind of makes sense into this perspective, are going to be testes and ovaries. So these will both produce hormones that will be released outside of the actual blood supply. And if you think about it with ovaries, the exocrine gland, some of the hormones they may be releasing will travel through different processes in the body and not necessarily stay within the blood supply. But our endocrine glands are what we're going to focus on today. So some examples of some endocrine glands are, there are quite a few that we're going to talk about. So you will have the anterior pituitary gland, will be an endocrine gland. You will also have a thyroid gland, that is an endocrine gland. Your adrenal gland is considered an endocrine gland. You have an organ called the parathyroid, which is an endocrine gland. You will have the pineal gland. And then you will have the thymus. So these are the main endocrine glands that we're going to talk about. What's interesting about these endocrine glands is all of these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 organs right here will produce the hormone, and they are going to release the hormone directly into the blood supply, whereas the exocrine gland are going to release it outside of the system. So when we're talking about endocrine glands, there's anterior pituitary, thyroid, adrenal, parathyroid, pineal, and thymus. And we're going to talk about the hormones that are produced and then released by each of those glands. But first, where are these guys found? So if you are to take the human body, and I don't have a picture, so we're just going to make it work. Bear with me. Here is the human body. When we're saying we're going to start at the top and then we're going to work our way down. So up here, you're going to have your brain. Coming off of your brain at the very bottom of it, right here, this organ will be your pituitary gland. We're going to talk specifically about the anterior and the posterior pituitary, but this is where your pituitary gland will be found. Deep inside the brain, right about there, this will be your pineal gland that we're going to talk about. The next gland you'll have, starting from the top down, is right underneath your hyoid bone, right in your throat. This endocrine gland will be your thyroid gland. This is where it is found in your throat. Underneath your breastbone, right on top of your heart, it's a long, kind of skinny structure. So again, it's underneath your breastbone. It's right below the xiphoid process of your rib cage, will be the thymus gland. So that is where you will find your thymus gland. When you come down to the underneath the abdomen at the very bottom, you have kidneys on either side of your system that sit like this. On top of your kidneys sits a gland. It looks like a little triangle, looks like a little hat. This gland is going to be your adrenal gland, and you do have two, so you have one on each side. So far, everything else we've talked about, there's only going to be one, but you will have an adrenal gland that will sit on top of each kidney. And then depending on male or female, here in the reproductive region, you will either have the ovaries or the testes, depending on male or female. But these are where you're going to find your endocrine glands. So how we're going to break down the next section is we're going to do a bunch of flowcharts. And what we're going to do is we're going to start with the endocrine gland, and then we're going to break down the hormones that are produced at each endocrine gland. So we're going to start with the easiest and kind of get to the hardest. So the easiest gland is going to be our pineal gland. So remember, your pineal gland is all the way at the very top. He sits in the middle of your brain, and the hormone that your pineal gland will produce and release is going to be the hormone melatonin. So melatonin is awesome. He's responsible for our sleep and our cycle of wake and sleep. He's around the third ventricle in the brain, but your pineal gland is pretty easy, and he releases the hormone melatonin. That was easy. The next gland we're going to talk about is going to be the thyroid gland. So the thyroid gland sits in your throat, right around the level of your hyoid bone in your neck. And your thyroid gland will produce two types. Ooh, so sorry, y'all. Your thyroid gland is going to produce two types of hormones. So we're going to do two branches. The first hormone that your thyroid gland will produce is the hormone calcitonin. And calcitonin is important for regulating your calcium levels in your blood. So the way calcitonin will work is it will decrease your calcium. So I'm going to do calcium 2+, it will decrease your calcium levels in your blood. So this hormone will be released if there's a lot of calcium in your blood and you need to get the communication to decrease the calcium levels in your blood. The way that this will happen, how it will actually decrease the calcium levels in your blood, is it will trigger an increase in calcium storage in your bones. So in AMP1, we talked about calcium and it's part of our bony skeleton. Your calciums are made up of bones. It's one of the minerals that make it a hard structure. So if we release the hormone calcitonin, it will cause calcium to be taken up and stored in our bones, therefore decreasing the level of calcium in our blood. So that's one hormone from the thyroid gland. The second hormone from the thyroid gland is going to be a category called thyroid hormone, and that is super easy to remember. So thyroid hormone is going to be broken down into two. You're going to have one called T3, and then you're going to have a thyroid hormone called T4. So it stands for two different things. T3 is going to stand for triiodothyronine. That's T3. T4 is going to stand for thyroxine. And these are two hormones. These are the hormones that are going to be reduced by the thyroid gland. So there are thyroid hormone T3 and thyroid hormone T4. And these guys are super important because they're going to be responsible for the rate of your metabolism. So they are involved with oxidation of your cells. So when you've heard of people say that they have hypothyroidism or hyperthyroidism, a lot of times what they're actually referring to is not necessarily calcitonin, but they're talking about T3 or T4 with regulation of their metabolism. But when we're looking at the thyroid hormone, we have calcitonin and we have T3 and T4 that are produced and then released from the thyroid gland. Okay, so we have done pineal, and the hormone is going to be melatonin. We've done the thyroid gland, and we have calcitonin, T3 and T4. So now we're going to move on to our next one, which is going to be our parathyroid gland. So our parathyroid gland. So this has thyroid in the name, and para means next to. So if we're talking about where the parathyroid gland is, I did not explicitly mention it earlier, but if we come up to this guy when we're talking about our thyroid gland right here, your parathyroid will be on the sides of that thyroid gland. Para means next to. So it's essentially where the thyroid is, but it's just right next to it. So the hormone you need to know that is produced and released by the parathyroid gland is PTH. Super easy to remember because the name of this guy is parathyroid hormone. That was easy. The parathyroid hormone is also going to be responsible for regulating blood, calcium levels in our blood. So the way he will actually regulate calcium levels in your blood is going to be different than the way your thyroid. So up here in the thyroid, when we had calcitonin, it would decrease calcium levels in our blood. Whereas in the parathyroid, it is actually going to increase calcium levels in blood. So the way it will actually do this is it will release that calcium from bone. So your calcitonin and your parathyroid hormone will work in opposition. So if we have calcium, your calcitonin will decrease the calcium levels, whereas your parathyroid hormone will increase your calcium levels. So these two work in conjunction with each other to actually create that level of homeostasis with your calcium. So that's very interesting. But your thyroid is responsible for calcitonin, and your parathyroid releases the hormone parathyroid hormone. Okay, so the next one we're going to talk about is going to be your thymus gland. Ooh, so sorry, y'all. Your thymus gland, remember, lives and can be found beneath the sternum on top of the heart. So your thymus gland will actually produce 3 hormones. 1, 2, 3. The first thymus hormone is going to be thymulin. You'll notice that they all kind of have a trend with the names. That does kind of help. And then the second hormone is going to be thymosin. And then the third hormone that is released by the thymus gland will be thymopoietins. And these all work to do something very similar. So all 3 of these are involved with the immune response. And they are going to be released when there needs to be the development of T lymphocytes. So your thymus gland plays a lot of implication when it comes to infection and your immune response. What's interesting about the thymus gland, just as a fun fact, is that this is very large in infants. And if you think about it, they don't really have an immune response. So your thymus gland needs to be very, very active because it will have a lot of reactions to any kind of invaders for that first couple years of life. But then as we age, it will actually atrophy and it will get smaller as we age because we don't necessarily need such a large thymus gland and immune response anymore because our body has built up its own immune memory. So that's just an interesting fun fact about the thymus. The younger you are, the larger it is. The older you are, it actually atrophies with age. Okay, so we've gotten pineal, thyroid, parathyroid, and the thymus gland. So the next one we're going to talk about is our pancreas. So when we're talking about our pancreas, he is actually going to be found right around the level of your stomach and your behind your stomach. He is considered an endocrine and an exocrine. So that's why I didn't put him up there, but we could actually put him on our little chart up here to talk about where he lives. So your adrenal gland is going to be right here. And that is where, ooh, sorry, not your adrenal, pancreas, behind your stomach. So your pancreas is considered an endocrine and an exocrine. So it releases hormones both into a closed system, a ductless system, and it releases hormones into a system that is open and has ducts. So endocrine and exocrine. There are 2 hormones you need to know from the pancreas, but these are probably one of the most common hormones that are in everyday language right now. Insulin is the hormone that is released by the pancreas. And the goal of insulin, this hormone, is going to be to decrease your blood sugar level. So it will trigger a system of homeostasis to decrease the level of blood sugar that you have. The opposite hormone will actually be glucagon. And glucagon is a hormone that relates to sugar level as well. But what it will do is it will increase blood sugar level. So in your pancreas, you actually have both the turn on and the turn off for homeostasis, the decrease the blood sugar and the increase the blood sugar through insulin and glucagon. So those are the 2 hormones you need to know from the pancreas. The other endocrine gland we're going to talk about is the adrenal gland. So the adrenal gland, there are 2 of them, remember, because these are the ones that sit like the little hats on top of the kidneys on either the right and the left. So if this is going to be my spine right here, you have your kidneys on either side, these lovely little adrenal glands sit like they look like little triangles, and they sit right on top of either kidney. So your adrenal glands look like this shape right here. They kind of have a kidney bean kind of look. Well, sorry, kidney beans look like here, and your adrenal glands essentially are going to have an outside layer and the inside layer. So if the outside layer is this black color right here, the inside layer would be that red. If you think about when we were talking about the brain, way back at the end of chapter or end of AMP2, we had the outside layer of the brain right here was called the cortex, and the inside layers all had a different name. The adrenal gland follows the same pattern. So you are going to have the adrenal cortex. This is going to be the outside. And then you are going to have the adrenal medulla, and this is going to be the inside. So if we're going to actually look at these two glands, here's my little adrenal gland looking like this. The outside layer around the whole thing is going to be your cortex. But this inside layer right here will be the medulla. These two things will produce different hormones. That's why it's broken out that way. So you have the cortex and you have the medulla. The adrenal medulla is going to release two hormones that are pretty common. The first hormone you need to know from the adrenal medulla is going to be epinephrine. So this is the hormone that gives you the ability to act, to fight or flight. It's adrenaline. It will turn your system on. Whereas your adrenal medulla also releases the hormone norepinephrine, which will turn off the system of flight or flight. So both of these are going to be responsible for helping regulate your sympathetic nervous system, your epinephrine and norepinephrine. If you're interested in anything to do clinically, nursing route, epinephrine and norepinephrine play a very big role in a lot of clinical settings. They can act as a hormone, and when they do act as a hormone, they are released from the adrenal glands. Your adrenal cortex is going to release a family of hormones called the steroid hormones. So these steroid hormones are called corticosteroids, which is from the adrenal cortex. So it's the corticosteroids. So this is a family of hormones that are steroid hormones. So think about all the way back to AMP1 with what makes up the structure of a steroid. All of these have that same steroid or that same structure. There are 3 steroid hormones that you need to know. You've got the mineral corticoids. Mineral corticoids. An example of this is going to be aldosterone. So a mineral corticoid is a steroid hormone that is produced by the adrenal cortex. And an example of that is aldosterone. And then what aldosterone will do is it will actually regulate water levels. So aldosterone, regulating water levels, has a lot to do with your kidney function, which makes sense because our adrenal gland sits on top of our kidneys. So you've got aldosterone. Another corticosteroid, I'm just going to go straight through it. I've run out of space all the way down here. That's 1. This is going to be 2. Is going to be glucocorticoids. Glucocorticoids. An example of the glucocorticoids is going to be cortisol, which is a stress hormone. And so this is going to be responsible with also increasing blood glucose. So glucocorticoids will increase blood glucose, and mineral glucocorticoids will help regulate your water levels. And then you're going to have a third category that are going to be your gonadocorticoids. So the root of this is going to be gonad. So this is a steroid produced by the gonads. And one thing that we know that those are going to be, we've already talked about these, but to put it into technical terms, a steroid that is produced by the gonads is going to be your androgens and your estrogens. So an example of an androgen is testosterone. So one thing to bring into perspective is this adrenal cortex. We're talking about this adrenal cortex. So we're up here in this adrenal gland. We're talking about this outside layer of your adrenal glands. But we're saying that it is a gonadocorticoid hormone that is produced. So these gonadocorticoids, androgen or testosterone is a perfect example, and estrogen are produced by the adrenal cortex. But these guys will, remember, we're talking about hormones. So these will travel through the blood and they are acting on a target hormone. If you were a betting person and we're talking about gonads, you could say that the assumption would be, and you would be correct, that the gonads would be produced by the adrenal gland, they would travel through the blood, and their target organ would actually be gonads. And that is very true. That is what happens for these guys. So it is testosterone and estrogen. They are produced by the adrenal gland, specifically the adrenal cortex. They travel on the blood, and their target organ that they will work on will be the gonads. Also, one thing to just go on to the next level is this was all of our adrenal glands, but we also said our gonads were endocrine glands. So now let's just move on to those. So your gonads, there are two different types. There's the female gonad, and then there's the male gonad. When we are talking about the female gonad, we are talking about the structure. Sorry, y'all. Female gonads, we are talking about the ovaries. And the ovaries will produce and release the hormone estrogen. The female gonad is an ovary, whereas the male gonad is the testes. And they will produce the hormone testosterone. So yes, estrogen and testosterone are produced by the gonads, but estrogen and testosterone are also produced up here by the adrenal cortex. So they are actually going to be produced in two different endocrine structures. Up here, the ones produced in the adrenal gland will travel through the blood and act on the gonads, whereas your gonads will actually still produce their own estrogen and testosterone. So it's kind of a double whammy of your androgens that you get. Okay, so we have done pineal gland, we've done thyroid, parathyroid, thymus, adrenal, pancreas, gonads. But now we're going to do the heaviest one of them all. And when we talked at the very top of the discussion, we said that one of the organs that you will have in your brain is going to be this tiny little structure that will dangle down right here, and that will be your pituitary gland. So we are talking about your pituitary gland right now. A little bit of background in your pituitary gland. There are two structures to it. So I'm going to take this guy over here and I'm going to blow him up. So here's your brain. And here is your pituitary gland. He kind of looks like that. There is going to be a front and a back to this pituitary gland. So if this is your brain, right here is going to be the anterior and back here is the posterior. So that makes this guy right here your anterior pituitary gland. And this part back here will be the posterior pituitary gland. So we're actually going to talk about a front and a back of this actual structure. When you look at them underneath the microscope, they have vastly different perspectives, which is very interesting. There is this tiny little stalk right here that comes off the brain, and this is going to be called your infundibulum. It's a fun word, infundibulum. And that is a little stalk that connects the brain to that pituitary gland. So, like I said, that there is an anterior pituitary gland and a posterior pituitary gland. But when we talked all the way at the beginning, we said that it was only the anterior pituitary gland that was considered an endocrine gland, and that is very true. So now we're going to come back to our pituitary gland, and we're going to talk about both. So in our pituitary gland, whoa, where'd he go? There we go. Okay, so in our pituitary gland, sorry if I'm making y'all dizzy. We are going to talk about anterior and posterior. So we're going to take this guy and we're going to split him into two. Ooh. So your anterior pituitary gland will be on the front, and then your posterior pituitary will be the posterior side. So the anterior pituitary has another name. He is also called the adenohypophysis. So your anterior pituitary is called your adenohypophysis. Your posterior pituitary is called your neurohypophysis. I did not spell that right. Hang on, yeah. So your anterior will be adeno, your posterior will be your neurohypophysis. So this right here is an endocrine. He is endocrine. So he will both produce and release a hormone. Whereas your posterior pituitary is actually going to be considered not endocrine. And the difference here is what we are saying, the posterior pituitary is not an endocrine gland, is because he is only going to be storage of the hormones. So he is still responsible for releasing hormones, but he does not actually produce the hormones. He only stores it. And there's only about two things we're going to talk about with him. We're going to spend most of our time on the anterior pituitary, but you do need to kind of know the difference, that the posterior pituitary is not considered an endocrine gland because it doesn't produce, it only stores hormones. So coming back over here to the anterior pituitary gland, the adenohypophysis. There are two categories of hormones, two different branches. These two branches are going to be called a trophic branch and a non-trophic branch. So the trophic branch is essentially going to be a branch of the anterior pituitary that releases hormones, and all of these hormones have a property that's called trophic. Whereas over here, the non-trophic, all of these hormones are going to have a property that is a non-trophic property. So what does that mean? A trophic property is going to be something where these hormones are going to actually be responsible for stimulating another endocrine organ to release a hormone. So a trophic hormone is something that is going to be released by the anterior pituitary, and it will travel in the blood and it will act on another endocrine gland. So it's a two-step process. You release a hormone to go to another gland to tell it to release a hormone. So it's a two-step process. A non-trophic hormone is going to not regulate another endocrine gland. So this will just act on whatever structure it needs to. So it is not a two-step process, if that makes sense. So we're going to start with our non-trophic. So these non-trophic hormones that are released by the anterior pituitary do not regulate another endocrine gland. They just are straight hormones. So what are the two hormones from the adenohypothesis that are non-trophic? You have two that come out of this branch. These two are going to be called growth hormone, is the hormone that comes from a non-trophic adenohypophysis, and another one called prolactin. Prolactin is PRL for short. Growth hormone is GH for short. So growth hormone and prolactin are non-trophic hormones that are released by the anterior pituitary gland. These hormones are released into the blood and they act on the body as a whole. They don't necessarily specifically go to another endocrine gland. What do they do? It's very interesting. So prolactin is really responsible for pregnancy, but one of its big functions is going to be milk letdown. So following the birth of a baby, prolactin is going to be responsible for having the mother's milk let down into the breast in order to have lactation. It's also responsible for breast development in general. Growth hormone is responsible for exactly what is in the name: muscle growth and bone growth. So if you think all the way back to first semester when you learned about the skeletal system and growth of the bones in development, growth hormone probably came up in that conversation because it is responsible for muscle and bone growth. So those are the two hormones that are non-trophic from the anterior pituitary. Coming down to this trophic branch, there are going to be three. 1, 2, 3. That are going to be from this anterior pituitary that are trophic hormones. So these hormones are going to act on another gland. So first hormone is going to be TSH, which stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. So TSH will be, sorry y'all, thyroid stimulating hormone. Let's try this again. Thyroid stimulating hormone is a trophic hormone. What this hormone will travel to and will act on will be the thyroid gland, which makes sense because he's in the name. And when he gets to the thyroid gland, he will cause the release of thyroid hormone. Another trophic hormone from the anterior pituitary is going to be the hormone ACTH, which comes into play a lot. And this hormone is called the adrenocorticotropic. Adrenocorticotropic hormone. Sorry, I ran out of space. Looking at that name, knowing it needs to act on another organ, adrenocorticotropic is going to act on the adrenal gland. So that is where he will travel in the blood and tell the adrenal gland to release an organ. So you've got thyroid stimulating hormone and adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH. The last trophic hormones is going to be a family of two different hormones. So these hormones are technically, I'll just go ahead and draw. We'll do it this way. These two over here act very similarly. We'll have the hormone FSH and the hormone LH. The hormone FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone. And the hormone LH stands for luteinizing hormone. So you will have FSH and LH, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Both of these hormones will travel and act on the same endocrine gland, and they will act on your gonads. Follicle stimulating hormone is responsible for the release of follicles, the growth and development release of follicles. A follicle is another way of describing a very immature egg or a very immature sperm cell. So it's responsible for the development of some of those initial gonad cells, your sex cells. Luteinizing hormone is responsible for the actual release of those in your system. So both of these will travel in the blood to your gonads, where they will actually act on your gonads. Okay, so to wrap up, we've talked about a lot with this endocrine system. So scrolling all the way back up, the main focus of today is looking at the endocrine system as a whole, explaining what a hormone is, how it will actually be released from certain organs, how it travels in the blood, and then it will act on another organ in the body. Some of those organs are going to be endocrine glands, where it will release the hormone directly into the blood. Those are the anterior pituitary, thyroid, adrenal, parathyroid, pineal, and thymus. We talked about those specifically. Then you're going to have some exocrine glands. This will release a hormone outside of the body, testes and ovaries. And we also talked about how the pancreas was both. It could be an endocrine and an exocrine gland. We talked about where those are found in the body, a general overview, and then we broke down each of those endocrine organs and the specific hormone that is released from them. So the pineal gland releases the hormone melatonin. The thyroid gland will produce and release the hormone calcitonin, T3, and T4. The parathyroid gland will release the hormone parathyroid hormone. The thymus gland will release the hormone thymulin, thymosin, and thymopoietins. The pancreas, which acts as an endocrine and an exocrine gland, will release the hormone insulin and glucagon. The adrenal glands, which consist of an adrenal cortex and an adrenal medulla, will release hormones that are going to be, sorry y'all, it's getting away from me. The adrenal gland, which has the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla, will release hormones that are mineral corticoids like aldosterone, glucocorticoids like cortisol, gonadocorticoids like androgen and estrogen, epinephrine and norepinephrine. So all of these are released from the adrenal gland. You do need to know which ones are the cortex versus which ones are the medulla. Then we talked about the gonads and how there's the male gonads and the female gonads, and they will release the hormones estrogen or testosterone, whichever one is appropriate. And then we talked about the pituitary gland. So technically the pituitary gland is made up of a structure that is an anterior and a posterior. Anterior is going to be called the adenohypophysis, where the posterior is called the neurohypophysis. The posterior is not an endocrine gland. It is just responsible for storage of hormones. It does not produce them. Whereas the anterior pituitary will produce and then release these hormones. In the anterior pituitary, there's two types of hormones. If you are a non-trophic hormone, you're just released into the blood and you act on a biological system, but you do not specifically target another endocrine gland. Those hormones are growth hormones and prolactin. However, your anterior pituitary also releases trophic hormones. And those trophic hormones are going to be hormones that are released and they specifically target another endocrine gland, telling it to release its hormone. So it's a two-step process. The trophic hormones are luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotrophic hormone, and thyroid stimulating hormone. So these are all going to be from the anterior pituitary. Just to wrap up the last section over at the posterior pituitary, these are not produced, these are just stored. The two hormones that are stored by the posterior pituitary are going to be oxytocin and ADH. Oxytocin and ADH. ADH will stand for an anti-diuretic hormone, which will also regulate your water levels. So these are the last two hormones that you need to know about, oxytocin and ADH. They, again, are not produced, but they are stored in the posterior pituitary. So for the goal of this section is to be able to identify the gland, not only be able to identify the gland, but you need to be able to identify the hormones. And then you also need to be able to identify which hormone came from which gland. And then you